Round 5 of the candidates took place today, and I'm just going to look at one game, the encounter between Vladimir Kramnik with the white pieces against Levon Aronian. A real bruiser of a game. Let's have a look. Kramnik opened with d4 and played rather a surprising opening. Now, he's a great specialist in the Catalan, for example. You could also go into a kind of Queen's Gambit here with bishop g5. But instead he played the seemingly modest pawn to e3. Kramnik has a real knack of playing openings that are rather underrated, but actually quite decent. And this is a way of avoiding preparation, but just getting, well, quite a decent position with white. It's a very natural way to play. So he exchanged on d5 and then gave a check. Now this is a really clever move. If the knight blocks, then the knight comes to e5 and can perhaps go into the c6 square. So for that reason black has to block, and now the bishop returns to d3, and you can see that black would like to play the knight into e4 to the outpost, but with the bishop now blocked by the pawn on c6, it's not possible to do that. So black is just a little restricted in his options. A finesse, but an important finesse. So because the bishop was blocked in by the pawn on e3, it has to develop to the long diagonal. It's still blocked by the pawn on d4, but one never knows when the long diagonal is going to open up. And here a good move from Kramnik. He played knight e5 straight away before black has the chance to prevent this move with, say, bishop d6 or bishop f8. So knight e5, excellent move. Now if this is exchanged, then white gets this lovely pawn duo, and that bishop points down at the h7 pawn. And, well, black's king looks, yeah, a little bit insecure in that position. So Aronian played bishop d6, attacking the knight, and Kramnik defended it with the pawn to f4. Now, this pawn formation, supporting the knight on e5, is known as the Pillsbury attack, named after the great American player Harry Nelson Pillsbury. He was around, well, over 100 years ago, turn of, well, 1890s, 1900s, something like that. And he won several games using this setup. It is very dangerous. Difficult to shift the knight, and white can use the third rank for his heavy pieces and maybe even sometimes open up the f-file. Aronian counterattacks. Now, there we go. The queen comes to f3, and you can see that white's pieces control the e4 square, preventing, for the time being, a knight coming into e4. So that's why Aronian exchanged and played bishop b4. So he wants to exchange bishop for knight, plonk the knight in on e4, and that gives him some security. So Kramnik avoided that. But that means the knight comes into e4. But in swinging the knight back, sometimes this can be used on the king side. Okay, let's take a look. So pawn to a3. Now the rook came to d1 opposite the queen. Very often there are tactics, so this is a useful move. And here, during the post-mortem or in the press conference after the game, Aronian said, well, I didn't like f6 because maybe the knight comes round to g4 and e3 and it doesn't look great. But Kramnik couldn't believe it. Of course, he wouldn't play his knight back to g4. Instead, he would play queen takes knight, an absolute shocker. If the queen is taken, then bishop c4 check, and knight f7 is the end with a deadly discovered check, taking the queen. Kramnik couldn't believe it, and neither could Aronian, because he'd overlooked this. But okay, he rejected pawn to f6 for another reason. So it's difficult for black to shift that knight. If he could, then black would probably be doing quite well. So Aronian had to find counterplay elsewhere. So he wants to play b5 and move the queen in to b6. Kramnik prevents that for the time being with a4. The rook swings across to c8. Okay, it's good on the open file. And now, well, Kramnik finds a very, very attractive manoeuvre. He could just keep going with this knight, but have a look. Black has defensive resources here. Now it looks dangerous to put the knight on f5, but look, if rook c7, then this bishop can come back to c8, hitting the knight on f5. And you can see black hasn't touched the pawns on the king side. And black's king position is actually quite robust here. So for that reason, Kramnik played this very clever move, queen h5, threatening queen takes pawn. Of course, that can be dealt with very easily. But now the queen comes back. And you can see that now white has something to bite on. When the pawn advances to f5, it's going to be possible on a good day to open up the f-file. Okay, Aronian played knight f6, supporting the knight in the middle of the board, and f5 came, of course, wants to open up the f-file. And here it's possible, perhaps, to play rook c7 to cover along the 7th rank. But instead, Aronian played g5. So he just wants to keep the king side completely closed. But this is such a committal move. You can see that pawn is a little bit loose, and black's king is starting to open up. Kramnik swung the knight round. Aronian needs counterplay desperately. He gave up a pawn. Now, I think you can see that rook takes knight is threatened because of the pin here to the king. Now, of course, Kramnik could take a pawn, but this doesn't look so serious. There's pressure on the b3 pawn. This b3 pawn is nothing to speak of. And, of course, black could perhaps exchange off this strong bishop on d3. So Kramnik just didn't bother with that. He put his king in the corner, defending against rook takes knight. And he went for it. And this looked incredibly powerful. You can see now the long diagonal has opened up for this bishop on b2. White's pieces look so powerfully placed. And now we can see the massive drawback behind advancing this pawn to g5. These squares are badly weakened. Now, Aronian played very aggressively here. He played his pawn to e3, so possibly trying to get in e2, but maybe opening up the long diagonal, and white's king sits at the end of that diagonal. Kramnik kept attacking. He said afterwards he simply thought he was winning this position. Both players running short of time here. If Aronian just tries to plug that, it's just not possible. You can exchange off and then play queen h6, and that pin is deadly. If the bishop moves, the queen just gets taken, and knight takes bishop threatened. It's all over. So after knight g4, Aronian was forced to exchange, but that brings the queen back to an excellent square, threatening the pawn on g5, and it's going to be mate. So that pawn needs protection. If f6, this looks fatal, really fatal. So Aronian played h6. And now knight e4. I mean, this looks just deadly. Knight f6 threatened. Sometimes there's also moves like knight g5, and it's going to be mate very soon. It looked as though Kramnik was just winning, but let's see what happened. Rook c2. This is an incredible move. White would like to just take on g5, but as Kramnik said after the game, he just couldn't see an effective discovered attack for the knight in this position. And in fact, black seems to be winning there, incredibly. So Kramnik, understandably, threw the knight in check. And now Aronian sacked his queen. Queen for a knight, and advanced with e2. So he's hoping to get some kind of threats with his bishop against g2, but of course what he's doing is he's keeping white's rooks kind of in check. They can't easily move up to the 3rd rank to attack because, well, there'll be a back rank checkmate. And this is a remarkable idea. Kramnik took on g5. And now, possibly, this is good enough to defend. But both players in time pressure couldn't be certain, and both players said, well, you know, white has so many checks here. You know, in practical play, when you're short of time, the problem is your opponent gets to move 40, he just makes lots of checks, gets to move 40, and then tries to find a win. So that's for that reason alone, Aronian rejected that and played another remarkable move. Bishop takes d5. Now that bishop can't be captured because of pawn takes rook, of course. Sorry, let's just get to that position. Okay, what can white do? Well, maybe, just maybe here, Kramnik missed a good opportunity. Completely understandably, short of time, he took the pawn with check. It doesn't look bad. Maybe bishop f6 is a win. And now rook g1, which means that g2 is protected. That's important. And if this is taken, then queen takes, hits the rook and the bishop. And after rook c5, well, we can nudge that one away. White has some winning chances in this position. It's not completely over, has to be said, but some winning chances. There are other variations, but I think one important one here actually is if bishop takes b3, just hoping that white will back down with a move like this. Now this really isn't so clear actually, because you know black is very solid here, but in this position the problem is white counterattacks here, and the threat is queen g6 checkmate. Rather a beautiful position. Listen, one is never going to see that kind of thing when short of time. Of course, this is a very computery variation, and Kramnik played the obvious move, and a good move too, bishop h6 check. King came here, and he took the bishop, threatening a mate. So that forces this, check, and now incredibly black survives with this move. The rook takes, preventing queen g7 mate. So white exchanges, and by force they reach a rook and pawn endgame where white has an extra pawn, but it's not much of an extra pawn. And well, the players worked very hard. This is still an ending that requires some rather delicate moves actually, but both sides, well, Aronian succeeded in defending here. I'll just zip through some of the moves. I mean, the basic problem is that it's not easy for white to take that pawn on b5. At least you can, but normally you'll allow black to take here. I mean, maybe it's simplest for black simply to play like this, and then you'll get some kind of ending like this, and the f pawn should provide black with enough counterplay. Aronian played here. Now he had calculated very well actually. And now here, and both players had looked at this. If king c6, I'm just going to show you this variation, it's very beautiful. This king pawn ending is a draw, just check this out. So king here, but it requires some delicacy. Okay, first of all, let's get rid of that pawn, and that forces black's king back. And now white's king comes back. Now the idea is white's king wants to stop the f pawn, so if the f pawn advances, then white's king will come back, stop the pawn, and then the pawn goes through. So it's important for black to play the king up first. The king comes back, and if king e2, then this is just a straight draw because black's king gets back, stop the pawn in time. So b5 instead, b6, and now the only move to draw is king h3, not king g3, because then here and we make a queen with check. So you have to play king h3, but that's sufficient for a draw because in this position, well, there you go. If here, here, and then we make a queen. Okay, a long variation, but typical of what you have to do in these technical positions. It's all about precise calculation of these long variations. Okay, Kramnik played king d6, and the game soon ended in a draw. Black got this f-pawn, and that gives him sufficient counterplay. There we go. In fact, they traded these pawns, excuse me, and, well, king g5 is probably good enough, but Aronian had calculated that this is actually drawing very comfortably. His king gets to the b-pawn before White's does. And they soon agree to draw. Let me just go through the final moves. And they exchanged and arrived at a position with just kings on the board. A fantastic encounter, tremendous fighting chess from both players. Great attack from Kramnik, but what wonderful defence as well from Aronian. So, after 5 rounds, Anand in the 5th round drew with Andreikin, so he still leads with 3.5. Svidler beat Topalov in a nice endgame actually. He had to work hard but slowly outplayed him. So Svidler, Kramnik and Aronian have 3 points, Anand on 3.5, and then Karyakin and Mamedyarov 2, they drew today, and Andreikin on 1.5. Thanks for watching.